today, federal raids, homes and businesses searched, and records seized. The $100 million a year housing program, exposed as rife with fraud, is being terminated immediately.
U.S. Attorney for Minnesota, Joe Thompson, tells me he expects the scope of fraudulent use of taxpayers' money will exceed $1 billion.
To me, that's astounding. How do you describe that?
It's an extraordinary problem, and the fraud that's pervasive in this state.
They said this was for housing aid. Turns out it was a $100 million payday for fraudsters, and the state just let it happen. Let's get into it because I don't know what is going on in Minnesota. It's crazy. There's so many issues, so much money being wasted by people taking advantage of the system. What this housing program was supposed to be, on paper, it looks like a good idea. Use Medicaid funds to help vulnerable Minnesotans find stable housing. So how did a well-intentioned program turn into one of the biggest financial disasters in state's history?
Federal agents are looking for evidence that taxpayer money that was supposed to help vulnerable Minnesotans find housing was instead stolen.
Computers, documents, boxes of evidence seized, including more than $100,000 in cash.
In a current Housing Stabilization Services investigation, the billing reached over $100 million. Thompson says the vast majority of those claims are fraudulent.
So how did a well-intentioned program turn into one of the biggest financial disasters in state history? Let me paint this picture for you. I mean, it's a terrible picture, but a picture nonetheless. A program called Housing Stabilization Services, or HSS, was supposed to help seniors and people with disabilities stay in their homes. Not exactly a controversial mission. Everyone agrees that kind of support matters. It was only supposed to cost around $2.6 million a year. Pocket change for a state budget. But instead of the proper checks in place, state officials launched it with almost zero oversight. They just trusted people to do the right thing. And we all know what happens when you do that.
New court documents are spelling out what investigators call an explosion of exploitation in Minnesota. Those documents detail a spike in a sector investigators say is ripe for fraud. Housing Stability Service claims went from an early estimate of $2.6 million in state dollars to a program paying out more than $100 million in 2024.
That trust opened the floodgates. Hundreds of new providers rushed in. Barely anyone was vetted. No one was tracking who was billing or what they were doing. Total collapse dumpster fire. HSS was launched to help people with disabilities find housing, but it became Minnesota's most expensive mistakes. Between 2020 and 2024, the program exploded to over $100 million in payouts. Think about that. From $2.6 million to well over $100 million. That is not growth. That's a runaway train of taxpayers' money going into probably the wrong hands. One of the examples of scams were providers submitting identical paperwork for different clients, none of whom were ever seen or helped. Scam, scam, scam. More than 700 companies were billing the state for housing support in a single year. And there were no system in place to check if any of those clients were actually being helped. No one checking anything. No one bothering to, check these places out to see if anything was making sense. The paperwork looked fine, but the services, not so much. By 2024, the program had ballooned, like I said, from the $2.6 million to over $100 million, with hundreds of providers billing for services that never happened. According to the DHS data, 77 providers had their payments cut off based on credible fraud suspicions. But in just one office building alone, investigators found 40 companies under review. One provider network pulled in nearly $9 million, and not a single client was helped. It just went to scammers, fraudsters, and Minnesota just let it happen. So this wasn't just one bad actor. This was a coordinated cash grab. State records showed that the program grew 40x its original estimate, but no one stepped in to slow it down. When you see tens of millions of dollars funneling through dozens of providers in one building, it's clear that this was massive and unchecked. That's why the feds had to finally step in, and what they found confirmed everyone's worst suspicions. In July of 2025, the FBI raided offices across multiple Minnesota cities. This was not some low-level fraud case. They're talking about major action happening. The acting U.S. attorney didn't hold back, called it a significant, massive scheme, said that the system was extremely vulnerable to fraud. So here's the big question. Even if people inside the system said that they saw this coming, why didn't anyone try to stop it? Some providers straight up admitted that this was way too easy to get approved. They filled out a few forms and boom, they could start billing. Investigators said that guardrails were basically non-existent from day one. There was no plan to vet these companies and no mechanism to stop abuse. And get this, at the Department of Human Services reportedly raised concerns early on, no one listened, no changes were made. Way to go, Tim Walz. I mean, at this point, he was almost, you could say, well, almost, they lost in a landslide, but this guy was going to be the vice president. And there's so many issues with his state. Even the providers in this program admit there was no oversight, no vetting, and almost everyone saw this coming. So when the story broke, politicians scrambled to respond, but critics say that they were asleep at the wheel. Under bipartisan pressure, the state finally suspended payments to 77 providers. But by then, the damage was already done. Tim Walz and the Department of Human Services came under fire for ignoring all these red flags. Lawmakers on both sides started to call out federal audits and full investigations. Because at this point, can you really trust Tim Walz? Even though he is the most powerful man in the state, if he's allowing all this fraud and scam to happen in his state, at this point, the feds are the only people that can actually try to find out what the hell is going on. The real damage to all this is the people who were supposed to be protected, like a disabled veteran who was promised housing help through the program and never heard back from anybody. Taxpayer money meant to help people in crisis was funneled into shell companies and ghost providers who needed real support got nothing. Experts now estimate over $1 billion in potential fraud across public aid programs in Minnesota alone. That is massive. Every dollar lost here is a dollar that didn't help someone stay off this, where real people were left without any kind of support. So obviously the state is doing damage control, doing things they probably should have did before this program launched. The state passed new rules letting DHS immediately freeze payments when the fraud is suspected. That's how stopping all those providers in the last couple of months. But at the same time, man, it'd be nice if they would have done this before they launched the program. They have also launched a fraud prevention and agency oversight committee. And so far, they received more than 700 fraud reports. And that number is climbing. It's a start, but watchdogs say that these moves came way too late. And unless people are held accountable, like fired or prosecuted, the system could probably break again. Minnesota is finally reacting, but obviously the critics warn that these new committees and new laws, the same loopholes may reemerge if accountability stays weak. Unfortunately, this is not just a Minnesota problem. Programs like this exist in almost every state, and many of them probably have the same weak oversight. The same assumptions that people won't game the system is out there across the country. And once fraud sets in, it's nearly impossible to untangle. Paper trails disappear, accountability just vanish. If a $2.6 million program in Minnesota can swell to $100 million and almost no one is watching, what else is going unchecked? This is what happens when bloated systems have no brakes and they just become bigger and bigger and bigger. But we'll continue to follow this story. Let me know what you guys think about this in the comments below. If you're interested in this type of content, hit the subscribe button. Thank you for all of your support. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and I see you guys in the next video.